For those that don't know me, I'm Nic Elliott. I'm head of the employment team at Actons. We're based out of Nottingham, working with clients across the UK, some of which you'll have heard of and are on the slide. Some are SMEs local to us who are doing great stuff, and we love working with those guys too. We cover the full range of employment law services, from employment tribunals through to TUPE issues, through to managing sickness absence, employment contracts, handbooks, policies, all that fun stuff. I guess if I had to say anything about what I specialise in, it's the messy end of employment law, as I describe it. So, one of our employees has punched a customer or something like that. What do we do about it? It's great to be presenting today. I have a team who are fabulous and keep me on the straight and narrow. If you'd like to connect with any of them, you can scan the QR code using your phone and the camera on your phone, and that will link you to our LinkedIn profiles. Laura in particular enjoys me encouraging people to connect with her. She's still a bit of a LinkedIn skeptic, so please do feel free to connect with Laura to demonstrate the value of LinkedIn to her and help her build her network. She'll hate me for that, but please do go ahead. In terms of what we're doing at the minute, a lot of what we're focusing on is employment law reform, so changes that are coming in the Employment Rights Bill, and we are regularly updating our clients and contacts on LinkedIn, actually, so that is one reason to get connected with us there, but also via our mailing list and all that good stuff too. So do get in touch and connect with us if you'd like to keep up to date with that stuff, because there are some pretty significant changes coming, so it is worth keeping an eye on. The other thing I like to give a bit of a plug for before we get into the session is a podcast that I run called the HRD Talks podcast. You can find that on our website at that web address, or pretty much any podcast provider service that you like to use. You can also ask your Alexa to play the HRD Talks podcast if you'd like, and you'll get that there. I think the latest episode is actually quite relevant to the session today. Jan's very open about her own personal struggles, and also how leaders manage through change, manage through difficult situations. So if you haven't listened to that episode and you're interested in this topic, you probably will enjoy that episode too. So please do check that out. And today, very, very, very pleased to be joined by Emma. So it's a slightly different format to our usual sessions, and we have a guest with us, and we're really excited about it. Emma's the founder of the Mental Health People. We are both experts in the Elevate Hub run by Claire Cathcart. And again, if you follow either of us on LinkedIn, you'll have seen us talking about that organization. And yeah, we met through the Elevate Hub, and we decided that it would be excellent to collaborate on this particular topic. Claire's getting some love in the chat, I can see. So that's excellent. She'll be pleased about that, I'm sure. So I'm just going to set the scene a little bit before I let Emma introduce herself and explain a bit more about what she does. But I thought actually the context for this topic would be interesting, because many of you on the call will be managing people or managing managers who are managing people. And I came across this NatWest report as part of the prep for the session. And I thought it was useful in terms of setting the scene as to why we think this is important to talk about. So again, it's rattling off some stats, and we'll try and get through them fairly quickly, but I did think they were interesting. So 87% of people felt that grief had impacted their mental well-being and had a direct impact on their performance at work. 48% of people felt that their grief affected their work most significantly over 12 months after their bereavement, which again is interesting when we look at the kind of leave and paid leave that we often see employers giving, which doesn't match anything as long as that, obviously. 46% felt they were not given enough time off to grieve, and 51% didn't feel supported by their organisation. 70% said that they'd not had the company bereavement policy shared in the last year. And again, one of the questions I've probably got for Emma is what she thinks about policies for employers, covering this issue. So we can get into that. And then finally, 68% felt that support resources were not clearly signposted to them at any stage. So it feels a bit like employers aren't necessarily doing the best job for their employees in this area. And, that's part of the reason that we wanted to talk about it, and hopefully why this session will be useful for you. So that just sets the scene a little bit. I'm going to let Emma take control of the slides.
Yes, thank you for the prompt.
No problem. And then she will introduce herself, and we'll get into the meat of the session. I'll be back a bit later just to talk about the legal bit in all of this, but yeah, over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Nick. And gosh, hello, and so lovely to be here and share this space with everyone to talk about a subject that impacts so many people, and for me personally is just so important for us to be talking about generally, because we don't tend to talk about death and dying, but especially within the workplace. So whenever we do sessions at the Mental Health People, we always kind of start with safety, because psychological safety is so incredibly important. So within this section, just to say that you can opt out your personal safety, any discussions that may make you feel uncomfortable. Please share your thoughts openly, but also be mindful that others may want to share personal experiences. And as with a lot of the work that we do within HR, we are going to avoid sharing personal identifiable information. We might not all agree, and grief, lots of people have different experiences of grief, but it's really important that we respect each other's views. And I think that's quite representative of the groups that we're working with, is that there will be differing views. And confidentiality. So what's discussed here stays unless someone's at risk of harm. So when we deliver mental health first aid training or suicide prevention training, we always talk about the fact that we will hold the space in terms of confidentiality unless someone is at risk of harm. Okay. And there are no silly questions. Part of my mission and why I set up the Mental Health People was about helping people to have confidence. And to have confidence, we need clarification. We need to ask questions. So please do that. And you may not think of those questions today. That might come, later this afternoon or tomorrow or the next week. Just know that the support is here for your questions, so you can bring those to us. So I feel like that's the kind of safety section done, which always helps me feel more relaxed into the session, to know that we have covered safety. And then a little bit of an introduction to myself. Very glamorous picture. So I view myself as this mum on a mission. So I'm the managing director of the Mental Health People, but actually the story behind the Mental Health People is that I am this mum on a mission who so sadly has been bereaved by suicide. And actually it will be 15 years in June, where my eldest son's dad died by suicide. And one of the things that Nick's mentioned already is the lack of support, the lack of understanding. I've spoken very publicly about how I was asked to take the day that my son's dad died as holiday, and to try and get back to work as quickly as I could. So that gives you a flavour of kind of a really awful time in my life and lack of support within the workplace, which kind of gives me a lot of energy and motivation to make places better. So with lived experience and qualifications, so our team of trainers and therapists are qualified specifically to work within suicide prevention. we go and do this amazing work. So we transform mental health within the workplace. So we do this in a variety of different ways. So courses, like I've spoken about, so mental health first aid, suicide prevention. We also do kind of bite-sized workshops on different topics. So we've got one today, a little bit later on today, about resilience. So how do we build resilience and balance within the workplace? We work in terms of coaching, so we do access to work coaching, so we support people into work and to stay in work, and we offer trauma and grief therapy. So all of the things that help create mentally healthy workplaces is what we love to do. And today we're talking about what is grief. And I'm very mindful, that there are a number of us on this session today that are highly likely to have experienced some form of grief. And a lot of the time we might not realise what we're experiencing is grief. And certainly, through the endless study that I've done in this particular area, because when my eldest son's dad died, I was like, right, I need to learn about mental health as much as I possibly can, and I need to understand what has happened and why this would happen. So I became a mental health first aid instructor, suicide prevention trainer. I spent a year working with Samaritan's head office, so understanding the training operations and the operations of delivering that model. And I've trained in trauma and grief with UK experts in the subject, and I learn a lot, and that's why I'm really keen to share it with you, and just kind of spreading the word around, and so we can really understand what grief is and how we can help people. So to kind of simplify this, grief is normal. This is a really human and natural reaction to loss. So it is something that we as human beings, our bodies and our brains are designed to experience following loss. And it can also be the conflicting feelings caused by the end or change in a familiar pattern of behaviour. Well, when we think about workforces and workplaces, there are endings and there is change. If we think about promotions, if we think about redundancies, there are these transitions within people's lives, and we don't always recognize it as grief. Okay. And I remember working with someone recently that was going through a really difficult time. And they said something that really resonated with me and my experience of redundancy 5 years ago, which was like, oh my goodness, this feels like a divorce. This feels like I'm going through a divorce. And so when we think about that, ending of relationships is where, we experience grief. Okay. So I've got a bit of a kind of guess the number for you. So if you want to participate in the chat, that would be really great. But can you fill in the blank? So 1 in blank people will experience significant bereavement by the age of 30. Can anyone guess? Thank you, Emma, for going first. So we've got 20, we've got 3, we've got 10. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Excellent. 5, 10, 34. Yeah. So the answer is 1 in 3. So 1 in 3 people will experience significant bereavement by the age of 30. So what does this mean? And feel free to unmute if you can, or to pop this in the chat. But what do you think this means for us? Being the people that have a duty of care for our employees, to know that 1 in 3 people will experience significant bereavement by the age of 30. I'd love to hear your thoughts. There are so many different types of grief and loss and experiences that people will have, and sometimes they're not always obvious. So there are, thinking about baby loss, there are individuals that we've worked with that have repeatedly gone through things like IVF. And so the loss of a dream, of attaining that dream, we can also experience grief as well. So there are so many types of grief and loss that we can experience. And so I guess in terms of thinking about our workplaces, we often can be quite reactive to what's going on in someone's life right now and what they might be experiencing. But what we also need to remember is that people will be coming to our workplaces potentially with unprocessed grief. They may not realise, or they may not recognise that actually they have experienced some form of loss. And this may be impacting their mental health and their well-being. So it's the stuff that happens while people are at work or outside of work, while they're in employment, but also it's what people are bringing to work as well. And gone are the days. I mean, I remember working in call centres years ago where we used to tell employees, leave your problems at the door. Well, we now know that's not true, right? People don't leave their problems at the door. What they're doing is they're suppressing it, and actually it still shows up at work. And I'm sure Nic could give us a whole list of examples of how these behaviours then can come out in different ways, So in terms of loss and grief, it's thought that there are more than 40 events, and here are just some of those examples. Okay, so there's more than 40 events. So we've got things like marital separation, imprisonment, marriage, so loss of independence, retirement. We've also got change of responsibilities at work, children leaving home, the beginning or end of school, so parents supporting that and the grief that can come from that. Change in schools. I've just been working with an individual where their child had been excluded from school. And then we've got things like loss of trust, which can often happen within workplaces where there's been change or where change has been poorly communicated. Loss of approval, so where maybe our reputation within the workplace has been impacted, and loss of safety, so where perhaps we once felt safe and now we don't, or actually we'd never felt safe. So there are all of these kind of things that contribute towards a sense of loss and feelings of grief. So it's quite broad, right? This topic is incredibly broad. And there are some myths. So myths and misinformation, I think, we talk about this quite a bit in terms of mental health on our mental health first aid course. But what I'd like to talk about today, so in the mental health first aid course, we talk about, the myths that have been that, we never had these issues before in terms of mental health, where actually we did. They were just called something else. So people would phone up with sickness bugs and headaches and stuff like that. So there's a lot of myths and misinformation, particularly around grief. So often we'll tell people don't feel bad about your grief or your loss. Whereas actually it's really important to process those feelings and emotions as to how someone is feeling. That you can go and replace the loss, that's okay. You can get another job, or you could get another, have another baby or something like that. Whereas actually this isn't the case. We can't replace that loss, because what we're talking about here is relationships, and one relationship can't replace another. Okay. We're often told to grieve alone, and this is definitely something I remember, this is over 20 years ago, and people would cry in the office, and what we were training managers to do was to hand people tissues and leave the room and then tell them to come back when they've sorted themselves out, or we would send them to the toilet to go and grieve on their own. So this kind of idea that actually people just need to go and do it on their own is not helpful, because what we do know about grief and loss is that it does need to be witnessed. Okay, so we do need support and help from other people. And then grief just takes time. And, I remember working with an employee who their line manager had said to them, this was in their return to work, their line manager had said to them, look, you need to go and speak to this other person in the office because they came back to work within a week and now they're fine. So you just, go and talk to them. And this idea that, getting over it, whereas what we know is grief is about how do we process it, and also how do we live with our grief and our loss, which is very different to just wait to be over it. Okay. And then the fifth one is, if we just be strong, then everything will be okay. And this idea of being strong, which again encourages people to suppress their emotions and not to process the grief. So there's quite a lot of misinformation, and from good intention, a lot of these statements are about helping people and with good intention, but questioning, is this effective in what we know around what really helps people with grief and loss? So I don't know if anyone's got any other kind of phrases that they want to throw out there that they've heard that they find really unhelpful. So I don't know if you want to pop those in the chat. So if you've heard something that you've found is unhelpful in terms of supporting somebody. So we've got a few examples in here, like, replace the loss, or it will take time to get over it, or something like that. Okay. But I'd love to hear what you've heard unhelpful things. Right, thank you, Sharon, there. So you don't look depressed. Oh gosh, Sarah, bringing the morale of the team down. So feeling like a burden. This can leave people feeling like they're a burden on the team, and this can then lead to people shutting down even further, and actually puts people at risk. Yeah, oh gosh, that's very dismissive there, Megan. So things will get better, everyone loses someone. And I can see there's an attempt at empathy there, but actually can be very dismissive and minimizing. So we hear these things, right? These things are being said. And we've also got this idea of like keep busy. So, and I think, distraction can be really important, and having, space away. But the idea of if that's all you do is keep busy, then there's no space for processing. There's no space for that. And then we just suppress it. We put a lid on it. And then there can be a time in future where that lid just doesn't work anymore. Oh gosh, okay, thank you, Nick. It didn't take me that long to get over it. Yeah, that comparison, this kind of comparison that happens. So one thing that I really think is important for us to talk about in terms of grief, I mean, talking about grief generally is really important, but also disenfranchised grief. So this is a grief that may be experienced in silence, and often leads to isolation and increased vulnerability. And this is something that I found with my grief, was this disenfranchisement, because there was a lot of stigma and judgment around how my eldest son's dad died, so dying by suicide. So that meant that it was very uncomfortable to talk about it. It wasn't socially acknowledged. There wasn't a lot of empathy for what happened. So our grief can become disenfranchised. And there are other examples of where grief can be disenfranchised. So baby loss can be one of those, but also pet loss as well. So I've worked with a lot of individuals where their grief for their pet is just not been acknowledged, and it's really impacted their mental health and well-being and loneliness and things like that. So what often happens, we hear people say things like, no one understands why I'm so upset over, and it could be my pet, or the loss of my baby, or and it's like they think it doesn't matter. But I feel like I've lost part of myself. So if we think about these relationships, this can be really painful. And we might hear things like, people keep telling me to get over it, but it feels like I'm carrying this heavy burden alone and no one gets it. So this real sense of loneliness, isolation, not getting our grief witnessed and not getting the support that we really need. Okay. And then we do need to think about the kind of neurobiological impact of grief. So there is an impact, there's an impact on the brain and the body, particularly emotional regulation. And so we really need to think about this in terms of suicide prevention strategies. So we know there is an impact on the brain, and with the amygdala, this is the part of the brain that controls emotional responses like fear and sadness. So when someone experiences intense grief, so traumatic grief, the amygdala becomes more active, causing heightened emotional reactions. And this is the kind of stuff that we might start seeing in the workplace. It might not be obvious that it's grief. We might see anger, frustration, we might see shutdown, we might see tears, and we might see people really trying to mask this as well. And then we have the prefrontal cortex. This is the area responsible for emotional regulation, decision making, problem solving, all of the things we really need people to do at work, right? Emotional regulation, decision making, problem solving. And in people that are experiencing grief, this area's functioning is often impaired, and it makes it harder to manage emotions and to react in healthy, more productive ways. So it's really important that we acknowledge this and how this can be affecting performance within the workplace, which I feel like this so ties back to your statistics, Nic, at the very beginning of what from NatWest. And I think this is also the challenge is where there has been trauma and traumatic grief, the importance of fast respondents. And sometimes there's the kind of, we work with a lot of people and organisations where, months have gone by and then they're waiting for occupational health and all of this kind of stuff. And, there can sometimes be this view as to, we just need to give this person time and space. Whereas actually, a lot of the people that we work with say, I wish I'd had help and support sooner, earlier. And how that can help with the processing, and ideally prevent things from exacerbating into chronic illness and things like that. So thank you. So I wanted to touch on the impact of bereavement by suicide. So the stress of suicide loss can cause severe disruptions in the stress response system, which can lead to chronically elevated cortisol levels. And this is the sudden and violent nature of suicide can lead to PTSD, further complicating the grieving process. And so this was a real kind of light bulb moment for me, because a lot of people were talking about grief and, oh yes, you and your grief, but they weren't necessarily acknowledging, and I don't think I was either, that this is so much more than grief. This is about trauma and grief. And so I think that's really important for us to recognise in suicide bereavement, but other situations, that actually there can be trauma and there can also be grief. And so I read this kind of description of grief with the volume turned up. So this kind of idea of actually so loud and so big and so consuming, and not always necessarily having that acknowledged within the workplace or even with friends and family, actually. So this kind of leaves us in this point as so what, if we know this is the case, if we know this is what's happening within workplaces, what can we do, as HR professionals, as people that are supporting employees? So I kind of wanted to open up that question to you. What do you think that we can be doing if we're sort of entering the workplace and we know this, if we know that people are coming into the workplace with potentially unprocessed trauma and grief, and also there are events that happen while someone is at work, and in employment. And I really would love workplaces to recognise that this time thing. And I think some of this, and Nic, I know you're going to talk about this in a moment, some of this is about the policies. So it's kind of, you get a set amount of days for your compassionate leave. And I would really love organisations to recognise that there isn't a time frame on grief. You know, for me, this particular bereavement was nearly 15 years ago. And, you know, some days are great, and other days, you know, it catches you. I mean, my son's grandma found some old photos only a couple of months ago, and it just, you know, he sent me these photos and it just knocked me off my feet. And this is something, you know, from 15 years ago. And, you know, had done a lot of processing, a lot of therapy and things like that. And, you know, when my son got married, so there are, you know, it's really important for organisations to recognise that it's not a done and dusted thing. It's something that we are all likely to live with, and just an acknowledgement of that. And I think this is what then kind of takes us into the legal bit, because it's like, okay, so how do we have policies that are inclusive of all of what we've just talked about? So it feels like a good point to hand it back to you, Nic, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Emma, and yeah, incredibly valuable. And thanks everybody for the discussion so far. We've cunningly titled the next section "The Legal Bit," and that's a bit of a giveaway as to what I'm going to talk about, unsurprisingly. But I think what I'm not going to do is talk through too much detail, and I think actually it may well be that the real value will be in some discussion towards the end. The best kind of resource that I found actually from a legal perspective in this area was the ACAS guide, and I don't always say that about ACAS, but having read through it as part of the preparation for today, I thought, well, actually it sets out you know, quite nicely the kind of legal side of this. So the entitlements that, you know, employees have when they suffer bereavement in particular, and you know, what leave and pay and that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to just rehearse that back to you really. I've popped a link to that guidance in the chat. It's very accessible, and I'd encourage you to go away and have a read of that. I guess when I was reflecting on this ahead of the session, it was interesting to me that in reality there's no legal right to paid time off when it comes to bereavement, unless at the minute it's parental bereavement leave, and that extends to 2 weeks leave and 2 weeks pay if you qualify. Clearly, based on what we're, you know, talking about today, it may well be that employers are already or should be considering, you know, how they approach that and are more generous. And yes, there are you know, compassionate leave policies and unpaid leave and holiday and all that kind of stuff, but we've already highlighted some of the, you know, difficulties around how that can go down with employees depending on how you manage those situations. Bereavement policies, an interesting one for me, and I think again we don't tend to encourage employers to go too heavy on policies, but they are often a useful guide for managers, and I'm going to talk a bit about, you know, how we might support managers do well in these areas, you know, on top of what Emma's already talked about. But a policy does at least give a kind of starting point for a manager who is thinking, you know, what do I do in this situation? What might this person have available to them? You know, where do I signpost them, and so on. But clearly, just repeating a policy at somebody isn't the way to do this. And, you know, if you've picked up anything from what Emma said so far, everybody's going to react differently in these situations, and therefore that kind of blanket approach to, well, the policy says this, therefore we must, you know, take a particular course, it isn't really going to work particularly well, I would say. So it's an interesting one, and maybe we can debate the policy point a little bit when we have some time for Q&A. The other thing that I wanted to flag was that change is coming in this area. So the Employment Rights Bill I mentioned, you know, is taking up a fair amount of time in terms of what we're advising clients on at the minute. And there are some proposals within that to extend the entitlement around pay and leave beyond parental bereavement leave, and have it apply to a wider group of employees, essentially. As with most of the Act, the fine detail of that is still to be finalised, and we do need to just keep an eye on that. But it's kind of going in the right direction, though I suspect a lot of us would say it's maybe not going far enough, but it is worth keeping an eye on what's coming down the track in that area. And then from a more kind of practical point of view, some thoughts on managers or supporting managers, because of course in the main the HR team will be there encouraging and supporting managers to do this stuff well. Actually making people aware of the policy seems like a good start, and again the NatWest report suggested that visibility of what a company's policy on this kind of issue wasn't great. It wasn't high. People didn't seem to be aware of what was available to them and what the company's stance on this sort of stuff was, and it may be that that goes on the intranet or wherever you have your policies, but at the very least as part of our management training, making people more aware of this issue seemed to make sense. I think the other obvious one is modeling good behaviors at a senior level. So people high up in the organization modeling this well, as with lots and lots of different issues, seem to me to be a good thing for them to do, and to be open about their own grief and the impact that that's having on them, and so on. I guess with a view to kind of breaking the taboo a little bit in terms of people feeling able to share on this issue. And then again, and I'm sure this is a lot of what Emma spends her time doing, but helping line managers understand what a good response actually looks like. And that in many ways seems a very obvious point, but I have no doubt, and again, the evidence from people even having shared on the call today suggests that some managers will do brilliantly at this, and other managers won't really know what they're doing and may do badly at this. And actually upskilling managers to do this stuff well, to understand this issue and how they might support somebody through it, seems like an excellent use of time and resource as well. The other practical one, and again Emma's touched on this, I think, is keeping in mind that longer term effect of grief. And very often managers are so focused on getting the person back to work and performing at the level that they need to, that it's very easy to forget that actually there will be very likely longer term impacts on that, and longer term support required. Resources we've talked about, and signposting people to the right support. And again, it would be interesting to talk about that, because I agree. I think mental health first aiders are excellent, and in fact I have been trained as one, and we have them at our place. But for the very complex situations where people are dealing with grief and trauma in particular, and I thought Emma's point on that was really insightful. There might be a limit on what they are able to help with. And then considering return to work needs, and I guess we see some of this done badly by managers in a whole host of situations relating to absence, and we spend a lot of time helping clients manage absence, but actually considering what is helpful for an individual returning to work if they have been absent as a result of grief of whatever kind, and getting the appropriate adjustments in place, flexibility in place for them, clearly is important. And it may well be that medical advice, occupational health advice, is useful for doing that too. So that's worth keeping in mind. In terms of next steps, I would genuinely suggest reading the ACAS guidance. It's not too painful. It's not like reading the Employment Rights Bill for anyone that's tried having a go at that. Bad idea. Consider a policy, and again, we can talk about that, but also just keep an eye on what's coming in terms of changes in the law. And it sounds likely that there will be an extension of support and leave in this area, though maybe not that significant, some people might say. So that's my kind of whistle stop tour through some of the legal stuff and the practical stuff to think about. Obviously, we've had a few questions as we've gone along. If you have any and you'd like to pop them in the chat or unmute, both Emma and I would be really happy to field those.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on the policy point, Emma, in terms of whether it's a good idea, bad idea?
Yeah, I definitely, we need guidance, don't we? There needs to be some sort of guidance, especially for managers, something to go to, but also for employees as to, well, what help and support am I going to get? I guess one of the things that I found really difficult was some of the ambiguity in the policy. So, for example, you know, would my son's father be considered as immediate family? You know, there's the terminology that goes into that, and I guess the training around that policy. So rather than just giving a manager a policy and that's it, because often what happens is then a manager will follow that to the T, is actually, this is the guidance, this is what we're saying, but also let's think about the individual and you know, what adjustments might need to be made. So yeah, I think that's important.
I would suggest connecting with Emma on LinkedIn as well. So she puts out some really insightful and interesting content there. And yeah, it would definitely be worth connecting with her. I think we might have run out of questions, Emma.
I was just going to say, your content is really good too, Nic. So
thank you. Yeah,
for that kind of like ditto.
We're both LinkedIn fans, aren't we? Absolutely. So we would like to see people there for sure. Okay. So thank you everybody for your questions. And Emma, again, thank you for agreeing to join us. Really, really insightful and useful session. We're already getting some comments along those lines in the chat. And yeah, do feel free to pick up with Emma, connect with her on LinkedIn, reach out to her if you could do with any support that she has mentioned as we've gone, or the services that she provides, which she mentioned at the outset. And yeah, have a great day, everybody. Thanks again, Emma.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone.